What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Comparative Politics. I hope you're doing very well. You're having a good week. I hope that you're feeling rested and prepared to get back into it. As you know, we are right in the middle of a conversation about federal and unitary states. And this is a conversation about the organization of power within the state, and in particular, how power is dispersed across federal, state, and local levels or concentrated in the hands of the federal government or the national government. This is an interesting discussion because we're getting into the spatial dimension of politics and the spatial dimension of power and states in the organization of states. Remember that the state is that human organization that successfully monopolizes the control of violence within a given territory. And that territory sets the boundaries within which the federal or the unitary state is organized and located. And we're still discussing the federal states before we get to the unitary states. And we're going to pick up by discussing an example, and that example is the example of Switzerland. Now, what I have planned for today is discussing some different examples, watching some videos. I plan to read a short article to you that relates to a current event that relates to federalism. And in general, I want to have a sort of interactive discussion where we use as much content as we can to try to explore the issues. So sit back, enjoy yourself, stay engaged, and let's get started. So our first example of a federal state is the example of Switzerland. And Switzerland is broken up into what are called cantons. This is sort of like their equivalent of provinces or states. So whereas the United States has states, Switzerland has cantons. They have 26 cantons. And these cantons roughly correspond to both cultural divisions between French, German, and Italian speakers, and then also religious divisions between Protestants and Roman Catholics. Now, Switzerland is officially a federal parliamentary republic. That means that at the federal level, there is a parliament as well as a prime minister, and of course the cabinet that belongs to the government. But cantons have their own constitution, their own legislatures, their own governments, and their own courts. And so while there is nationally a parliamentary system in charge of legislating and making laws on the national level, each region or province has its own institutions, everything from its own constitution to its legislature, to its government, to its courts. Now, this is the situation in the United States as well. So, for example, where I'm from, Nebraska, there is a constitution, but there's also a unicameral, a single house legislature that houses the legislators who themselves don't have a partisan affiliation consistent with the Constitution's banning of party affiliations in the legislature. There's also a governor and a government in the form of that governor and in their cabinet. And then there are also courts. In California, there's a constitution, a legislature, a government, and then courts as well. Switzerland is much like California, or much like the United States in this regard, in that we have these units too. It's just that the way we divide up those units and the names that we give them might differ. But back to Switzerland, one of the interesting things about Switzerland is that it has so many different languages: German, French, Italian, Romansh, and then there are also bilingual areas and cities as well. But what you'll notice is that these different provinces or cantons roughly correspond to linguistic divisions. So you notice that the German-speaking provinces or cantons are usually whole, meaning those German-speaking areas have their own jurisdiction. It's the same for the French-speaking areas, where you see a lot of sort of boundaries of cantons corresponding with the boundaries of the French-speaking populations in Switzerland. Then it's the same with Italian as well, although Italian is spoken much less. But yet again, you see that here in the South, the territorial jurisdictions that exist are those that correspond to the distribution of Italian speakers. So all the Italian speakers are in this southern province or this southern canton. This is an example of how provinces and states and cantons tend to correspond with the distribution of different language and different speakers in a country. The cantons of Switzerland are represented here, and you see all the different ones. They have their own capital, and those capitals usually house their government institutions. Now, Brazil is another example of a federal state. Brazil has a federal district here in the central part of the country, but it also has all of these different states. States from Amazonas to Mato Grosso do Sul, Paraná, Rio Grande do Sul, a large number of different states in Brazil. Brazil is the largest federal state in Latin America. And as the largest federal state, it also has the most extensive and involved state governments in terms of the authorities and the responsibilities that they have. What's interesting about Brazil, moreover, is that there's a lot of decentralization to the local level. And so local communities are often involved in deliberative democracy practices where they're able to influence the budget and they're able to participate in ways that make their voices heard in a concrete fashion. And so Brazil is an interesting example of a federal state, not just because of its size, but because of the extent to which the different levels have been empowered to carry out different functions. So we arrive at this question that I posed to you last week. And the question is, what are the pros and the cons of choosing federalism? Why might we choose to adopt a federal state? Why might we choose not to adopt a federal state? And so far, what we've talked about relates mainly to responsiveness and representation. So many students said that federalism permits us to create governments that are more responsive to voters and to ordinary people and to the people who are affected by the policies created. We also talked about how it's possible to create governments that are more representative of the people in a certain area. There's a closer link between those people and the government if, say, you decentralize power to the state level or even the local level, and you permit them to govern themselves and engage in what we sometimes refer to as home rule. These are both obvious advantages of federalism. It's possible to think about, for example, how in a place like India, the choice to transition to federalism can help to resolve armed conflicts between dissident groups in faraway parts of the country and the central government. I gave you the example of India and talked about how the strengthening of the Indian state largely relied on choosing a federal solution and using federalism to kind of grant further autonomy to some of those breakaway groups, in particular in the northeastern part of the country. These are all advantages of federalism. You can strengthen the state by winding down armed conflicts and granting autonomy to dissident groups. You can create more representative governments at the state or the local level. You can create more responsive governments. But there also are some drawbacks as well. And those drawbacks can relate closely to the different players you have involved in the policy process. From a strictly practical point of view, if you have a federal government, a state government, and a local government, that's two more governments than you would typically have in a unitary system. And so you just have more butts in the kitchen, so to speak, and it becomes more complicated making decisions, governing. Sometimes there are overlapping jurisdictions and there can be power struggles between different levels of government. Sometimes there are challenges relating to coordination and getting the different levels to work together effectively. Sometimes there are challenges relating to exerting central control over the spending of federal revenue that is channeled to state and local governments. How, for example, does the central government ensure that that revenue is spent carefully? Can they audit the spending of that money by state and local governments, or does the existence of these multiple governments make that a challenge as well? Before we move on, can you think of any other potential disadvantages of a federal state? Can you think of any other reasons not to adopt a federal state where power is distributed between a federal, a state, and a local government? Let me repeat the question. Can you think of any other disadvantages of adopting a federal form of government?
I think maybe one of the disadvantages, like in our case, is that, well, I was gonna say that maybe certain areas don't get the same kind of representation that they want, but I guess in the U.S. case, that's not exactly true. But maybe like in a case if a country is like really big, like the U.S., if they had a federal system, maybe a lot of areas wouldn't get the kind of representation they want.
At the federal level, like say in the legislature?
Right.
So why do you think that might be the case? Can you think of the link between the two? Alejandra says less representative of the people. Dorian says abuse of the people in power, maybe even corruption in the system of government. Laura says one disadvantage is that when it comes to federalism, it doesn't bring people together to the government. They are divided. Okay, so I'm wondering about how the federal system might be less representative. It certainly might be more representative on the local or the state level because we're decentralizing power and letting them govern themselves. Undoubtedly, that might be more representative, but it may be the case that at the national level, the federal system is less representative. But I'm wondering why that would be the case and how we could make that argument. Can you make an argument as to why federalism might undermine a representation? Dorian says abuse of the people in power, maybe even corruption in the system of government. I'm also curious about how that might come about. It could be. I'm just curious what the argument would be. Laura says that it's possible that federalism, by dividing people and dividing states, could actually undermine the consensus building that is often critical to a functioning government or a democracy in particular. I can easily see that being possible, especially if the federal system extends a lot of power and responsibility to those state and local governments. If it does that, I think it's possible that the different states might begin to think for themselves and figure, well, why do we need to cooperate with others at the federal level or even between the states if we can govern ourselves? And it may be difficult to reach consensus under that circumstance if you've so substantially empowered those individual states. I can see that. Efren says one disadvantage is that citizens may suffer from inequalities across states. Good. That's a really important point. So when you have all these different jurisdictions in different states, those different states might not perform equally well, either economically or politically or socially. For example, what makes California different than Alabama? Well, California is the 5th largest economy in the world by itself. Alabama is a relatively poor state that remains largely agricultural. California has a huge agricultural sector as well, but it also has the biggest tech sector in the world. It's a huge economy, and people gravitate to California because of the sheer wealth and the income gains that become possible if you live there. Now, the inequality between California and Alabama economically in this regard is extensive. What's interesting is that there's also a political inequality, but it works the other way. Alabama is relatively overrepresented relative to California because it's a smaller state with 2 senators in the Senate, with a number of electoral votes that is disproportionately large compared to the number that California gets. So these inequalities do exist, and those inequalities can change the experiences of the citizens that live in the different units. And those differences can be really important politically and economically. And it can really be the difference between night and day. Take it from me, I'm from Nebraska, like a semi-rural place. It's kind of like a developing country. You know, there's not a lot there. And in some cases, it's hard just to get services, you know, let alone access the things that you want, and that you might not need, but would be nice to have. Anna Martha says federalism divides because the polarization is high. So it's possible that these different units become polarized because of their differences and their different ideologies or their different views. California, for example, is a relatively blue state, even though the central part of the state might be more conservative. Alabama, again, to go back to our earlier example, is a very red state. And so the polarization between Alabamians and Californians might be extensive, and it might be difficult to forge the kind of consensus building that is so important in a democracy because of that polarization. Anna Martha says, I mean in the whole country. Certainly, Anna Martha, but when you say the whole country, we are talking about the differences between the states that make up the whole country, right? So California and Alabama is an example of those differences, but the differences between blue and red states, the polarization, the differences between agricultural and coastal states, those are important differences. So those do relate to your example. Now let's talk about those advantages of a federal solution before we discuss some of these disadvantages that we just talked about. So in the first place, federalism is useful because it can appease cultural differences in language and ethnicity. And so Belgium, Switzerland, and Spain are all examples of countries that have extensive linguistic and ethnic diversity. They're very heterogeneous countries, and therefore they have a lot of different groups concentrated in different regions. A federal solution, by sort of parceling out power, distributing power among the regions, helps to bring those different regions together by giving them the autonomy that they demand in exchange for submitting to central authority. The geographical differences can also be a good reason to choose a federal solution. So there are political attitudes and regional preferences that can vary considerably. Again, those examples of southern states versus maybe coastal progressive states or bluer states, the preferences in the political attitudes vary considerably between those different types of states. And what that means then is that extending power to those states and letting them govern themselves permits the achievement of local efficiency or adapting policy to the circumstances on the ground, the views and the preferences of people, the economic and the social conditions, the types of economy. And so the case of Brazil is interesting in this light because federalism in Brazil stemmed from different social, economic, and political conditions between the different states. And so, for example, some states that are concentrated in the area of the Amazon have very different economies than coastal states or states that are located on the perimeter or outside. These different circumstances mean then that there are differences in the economy, differences in the society, differences in ethnicity, and differences in language as well. And so these really, really matter a great deal. And so federalism can be a way to accommodate that diversity without sacrificing central authority. Then there's the military factor. When countries experience an external threat, the joining together of the different units of the state becomes critically important because that's how you mitigate the external threat, by building nationhood and forging unity so that you can address that external threat in a united strong, effective way. And so the United States is one of the clearest examples of this, in addition to the US being an example of federalism growing out of these different social, economic, and political conditions. Finally, there's the economic factor. When you have a lot of different units, you need to create a common market that promotes economic activity. And a federal solution helps to accommodate diversity while sort of creating uniformity between the individual states. And so in the United States, for example, in the 1900s, or the 19th century, I should say in particular, the courts were very, very much involved in harmonizing the interstate trade and other policies of states in the United States. Even though it was a federal system from the start, the individual states that existed and were being created did not all have the same policies. And so the federal solution was to create a common market by harmonizing the policies of the different units so that there could be the promotion of economic activity in the substantial economic growth that would characterize later periods. This was also the situation in Australia. So the advantages of federalism are many. Based on what we've discussed so far, we can identify a few of these. First and foremost, it satisfies the popular public policy preferences of citizens and constituents. And so when there's a lot of variation from unit to unit or region to region within a country, satisfying those different preferences by granting them autonomy becomes critical to getting them to continually support the central government while still promoting economic activity within their own unit. Of course, it also brings the government closer to the people, and that means tailored policies that are more reflective of the needs of particular places. There's also the fact that when we create different states, we create incentives for subnational or state authorities to perform well. Why? Because of those inequalities between states that we've already identified. Those inequalities that relate to the performance of the economy, the performance of the political system. In particular, higher economic growth in some states compared to others can draw people from other states to that state, and it creates a motivation for the authorities to perform well. And then finally, there's the fact that federalism permits us to engage in policy experimentation in subnational units. When you have all these different state governments in all these different states and provinces or regions, you have a lot more governments just in general. And that means then that those different governments can engage in experimentation. They can adapt policies to changing circumstances. They can try to figure out what works best. And we can learn a lot from those individual experiences. So when we talk about inequality in the incentives that subnational authorities have to perform well economically or politically, one of the first states that comes to mind is California. I'll be the first to admit that I moved from Nebraska to California partly for economic reasons. I went to grad school at UCR. I got my PhD there in political science. And the reason I went there was because California was the promised land. I grew up in a small place with very few opportunities, and getting out was essential. And California for me was a gateway. Now, California was a gateway because it's a population center, it's an economic center, it's an international hub, and it's a place with a lot of wealth and a lot of income. And part of that picture is inequality and the relative increase in inequality between the rich and the poor. But part of the picture as well is just sustained economic growth that has led to the top of the ladder obtaining so much of the gains. And so that growth was what made it possible for me to go to California to study, because the expansion of the University of California and new and more resources for the university system meant that there was a place for me and that I could get funding and go there. And so California is one good example of inequality between subnational units and how some states can perform better than others and become quite important as a magnet for drawing people to that place. We can also take a look at different states in terms of the net in migration and the net out migration. Countries that are seeing, excuse me, states that are seeing more people move in than move out have a number that is greater than one. States that are seeing more people leave than move in have a number that is smaller than one. And so this is pretty interesting data. What we see is that some states like California and New York are actually seeing fewer people move in and more people move out. Some other states like Texas, apparently South Dakota, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, are seeing more people move in than move out. And this might have to do with the fact that California is becoming increasingly expensive. It's becoming harder and harder to live there if you are middle class. In states like New York, where I live, are also difficult to move to because of the same reason. And so we're seeing some movement away from some of these traditional centers towards places that are much cheaper and that traditionally have been less populated. South Dakota, for example, let me tell you, that's a place that doesn't have much, but it's a very cheap place to live. And there's also a growing oil industry, I believe, in South Dakota, as well as in North Dakota. And so movement to places like South Dakota is on the rise. This is what we see in a federal system where different states have different economic conditions, different social and political conditions, different circumstances. In some ways, the differences between California and South Dakota are as substantial as the differences between, say, California or the United States and some other country entirely. And so what we have is we have basically countries inside countries. And this is what a federal system makes possible, the movement of these people in this way for these kinds of reasons. When you look at this kind of data, does any of this surprise you? Do you see any patterns or trends here that are unexpected or you think might be telling for some reason or another?
From my perspective, I'm seeing like in the Middle West, surprisingly, there's people moving out. I'm kind of surprised by that, but I'm also seeing like in the South part, such as like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, and like in the coast, like there's actually like a more like migration in, which is kind of surprising because like it's stereotypically like expensive. So it kind of showcased that even there's some areas that like kind of may be related to poor economic situations or privilege, such as education and all that stuff. So yeah, that's my input on this.
Yeah, so some of these results, Efren, are surprising. Like I was surprised to see that more people are leaving California than moving in. I thought that pattern of migration into California was continuing. I was also a little surprised to see the growth in Florida, but I guess that's understandable. Maybe from the perspective of like the movement of like maybe older Americans or older people. Some of this data is interesting. North Carolina is growing quickly, as is South Carolina. Those are emerging markets, sort of. Some of these states are kind of growing more quickly because some of the others have kind of had these periods of growth in the recent past. And so California, for example, for many, many years was a magnet and was growing more quickly than any other state. But it seems to be kind of slowing down. And it looks like a lot of that movement is now kind of going to some of these other states that are less populated and that might represent more attractive locations, for young people in particular who might have a lot of school debt or just don't have a lot of money. And I'm willing to admit that includes me and I'm sure many of us. And so California is expensive, the Central Valley less expensive, but we can probably understand why there's a movement to some of these cheaper states because the need to cut costs is vitally important. And so this is interesting, but the point that I want to make to you is that this becomes possible when we have a federal system. If these were all just, areas of the country that were part of a larger unitary state, these differences would not be discernible and we wouldn't have these boundaries and these possible changes from one state to the next. There's also the fact that in subnational units like states or provinces or cantons, the authorities can engage in much more experimentation, and they can figure out policies that work well for them and that might potentially be sort of magnified and projected onto the national level at some later point. And a good example is the clean air and environmental protection agencies in California. California has its own clean air and environmental protection districts that represent basically levels of government on their own. And California has been central to the development of clean air vehicles and technology and environmental standards for cars. So this is something that you see all the time. Clean air vehicles in California have this, and this is that very, very recognizable logo or sort of image. And this distinguishes a clean air vehicle from one that's not. And this is something that came from California. What's really interesting about federal states is that policy innovations that happen at a subnational level can be so important that they can force manufacturers to change their standards to comply with new environmental protections. So for example, in California, California is the 5th biggest economy in the world. When California changed the guidelines for the creation of new cars and required stricter environmental protection rules, car companies had to follow those rules and create cars that had those features if they wanted to sell cars in California. And so what happened was California single-handedly was able to shift the priorities of the car industry. Now, in recent years, President Trump has tried to rescind California's authority to issue those regulations so that California does not have the power to influence the market in that way. But for the time being, California did have that effect, compelling the car industry to make cars that met the environmental protection guidelines and the carbon emission standards of California. That's one really interesting thing about federal districts that is not true in unitary systems. Anna Martha points out that non-smoking policies are also state policies. States have decided on their own whether they want to ban smoking in certain places and the specific rules around smoking. So for example, where I'm from in Nebraska, smoking bans came around much, much later than they did in, say, California or Washington or Oregon. And this is, again, a reflection of differences in political attitudes and preferences and differences across states in the agendas that they have. And so I want to read a question from Rady. What is the difference between getting the clean air sticker or not in terms of if there's a special treat or compensation? I don't know, Rady. I just know that cars that are clean air vehicles that don't produce emissions get this sticker. Is there a benefit for the individual who buys the car? I suppose. I don't know. I don't have one myself. But the point that I was making was that California raised its emission standards, meaning car companies had to make cars that met certain requirements if they wanted to sell cars there. And so for that reason, California was able single-handedly to compel car manufacturers to change their production requirements because California was such a big economy. If they didn't meet those requirements, they couldn't sell cars in California. Ian says you can ride in the carpool lane. Oh, I didn't know that. Now, there are also some disadvantages, and we should be clear about those disadvantages because they exist too. So different layers can lead to the duplication of government and overlapping prerogatives. So when the federal government and the state government have responsibilities that somewhat overlap, there can be a duplication of government or a sort of multiplication of responsibilities. This duplication can lead to all sorts of coordination problems, make it difficult to figure out who is doing what and who should do what. And sometimes it can be a waste of resources and waste of time. There's also the case that power sharing between the different units can complicate decision-making. So sometimes states and the federal government disagree and they don't want to work together on certain issues. Environmental protection and emission standards is a good example. The Trump administration has rescinded most environmental protection rules put in place by the Obama administration, and they've also taken aim at the admission standards in California. And so the sort of power struggle between the two of them, between the federal government, which seeks to take away the power of the states to issue these guidelines, and states like California who wish to exert their power to issue those guidelines, it has complicated decision making because there are now questions about, well, who actually has the right to make decisions in this area? State governments can block reforms of the national government or delay their implementation. So for instance, when Obamacare was passed in the United States, one component of that was the expansion of Medicaid marketplaces in individual states. Now, in the years following the passage of Obamacare, most Republican states, most red states, blocked the implementation of those Medicaid expansions. Now, it was technically up to them whether they wanted to accept the money and expand those marketplaces, but the assumption was always that they would do so, and that the implementation of Obamacare would manifest partly in the expansion of Medicaid. Now, the delay, and to this day, the blocking of that implementation has meant that many people in many red states have not been able to obtain health care. And this has been, in effect, a blocking of the implementation of the law, which originally envisioned the expansion of those markets. It's also the case that subnational competition can lead to a race to the bottom. And I'll give you an example. Different states have routinely competed with each other to attract investment from foreign companies and multinational companies. One example is Foxconn, which is a technology company who made an investment in Wisconsin. Now, what did Wisconsin have to do to try to draw that investment, which has up until now come to nothing? They had to cut taxes and give Foxconn all sorts of benefits: low taxes, relaxing regulations, relaxing protections for workers, all sorts of things that were designed to attract the investment of Foxconn. Why did they go to the bottom in that regard, cutting taxes, cutting protections? Well, they did so because they had to outcompete other states who were also offering Foxconn other sweeteners, hoping to attract their investment. And so this is a race to the bottom, where Wisconsin is willing to cut taxes on Foxconn almost entirely, cut protections, specifically for the purpose of attracting its investment. Now, to this day, Foxconn has not actually invested anything in Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin taxpayers essentially paid most of it, because in addition to cutting taxes and cutting regulations, they also decided, the Wisconsin government, that taxpayer money would finance much of the investment itself as part of the deal. And so this is a race to the bottom, putting states in a situation where they need to outcompete each other to attract investment. And then finally, when you have all these different states, it's difficult for national governments to implement redistributive policies. Those tax policies that I talked about, it's different when you have all these different regional or provincial or state governments, because those tax policies that national governments pass are essentially mediated by all those different governments, and all those different attitudes and preferences that come into the picture then become quite consequential. In essence, the Obamacare example that I gave about the expansion of Medicaid marketplaces, that's essentially an example of how it's difficult for national governments to implement redistributive policies. Ian says, I think the government was also giving tax incentives when it started to get people to buy them. How is it that lower governments can undermine federal government with no repercussions? For example, marijuana is federally banned, but legal in states. Interesting question, Ian. The truth is that it does remain the federal government's prerogative, and that's why raids of dispensaries still happen. Technically, legally, it still is the prerogative of the federal government. It's just that I think that kind of informally, the federal government has begun to look the other way because of the intense effort on the part of states to exert their influence in this area. There's been such a movement in states to liberalize and legalize and decriminalize that there's quite a bit of momentum. And I think all told, the federal government is on the losing end of this issue. And I think that's reflected in the sort of drawdown in raids of dispensaries. You just don't see that happen as much anymore. I don't know if it still happens at all, but that's a good question. And I think this is part of what we get at when we highlight the disadvantages of federalism, including the fact that power sharing might complicate decision making and the different layers can often disagree. Now, I want to actually give you an example of federalism in COVID-19. And I'm going to do this by opening up a link that I want to share. Hold on. Just a moment. For some reason, it's not giving me the correct link. Okay. So we're going to use COVID-19 as an example of some of the complications that can arise in a federal system when confronted with big events or shocks or emergencies that require the cooperation of different levels of government. So this is an article from April 2020 called Federalism Meets the COVID-19 Pandemic, Thinking Globally and Acting Locally. And I'm going to read this to you so that we can get a sense of some of the issues that arise in this context. As we watch President Trump tell the states that they have to do more to find their own personal protective equipment for their healthcare workers, governors lash back with demands for a national leader who will unlock the emergency powers of the federal government. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed major weaknesses in the federal system of public health governance, which divides powers among the federal, state, and local governments, argues SHP's Michelle Mello in this New England Journal of Medicine commentary. The coronavirus, she writes, is exactly the type of infectious disease for which federal public health powers and emergencies were conceived. It is highly transmissible, crosses borders efficiently, and threatens our national infrastructure and economy. Strong, decisive national action is therefore imperative, writes Mello, a professor of medicine and a professor of law, and Rebecca L. Haffigi, a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Yet the federal response has been alarmingly slow to develop, fostering confusion about the nature of the virus and necessary steps to address it. The authors warn this lack of interjurisdictional coordination has and will cost lives. Though states must respect constitutionally protected individual rights, such as due process, equal protection, and freedom of travel and association, the Constitution puts primary responsibility for public health with the states, cities, and counties. It gives them the right to exercise broad police powers to protect their citizens' health during ordinary times. In extraordinary times, like the ones we're experiencing right now, states and the federal government can activate emergency powers to expand their abilities to act swiftly and protect human life and health. All 50 states and dozens of localities in the federal government have declared emergencies. The resulting executive powers are sweeping. They can range from halting business operations to restricting freedom of movement to limiting civil rights and liberties to commanding property, Mello and Haffigi write in the perspective. This emergency legal framework has led to too few checks and balances on poor decisions. Historically, in the direction of being overly aggressive, write the authors. They note a good example is when New Jersey's governor ordered a nurse returning from Sierra Leone during the 2014 Ebola outbreak to quarantine, contrary to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention guidelines. Too little, too late? Today, we find ourselves in the opposite situation. The federal government has done too little, the authors write, perhaps because of misleading early statements from federal officials about the gravity of the COVID-19 threat. Public sentiment has weighed against taking steps that would impose hardships on families and businesses. The tumbling stock market and unprecedented 10 million unemployment claims last month also have created further pressure by the federal government to project a sense of calm. The resulting laconic federal response has meant that a precious opportunity to contain COVID-19 through swift, unified national action has been lost, a scenario that mirrors what occurred in Italy, they write. So the states had to pick up where the federal government fell short, the authors note. Many jurisdictions issued stay-at-home orders, others did not. As of March 31, more than a dozen governors had yet to issue statewide stay-at-home orders, and 8 had only ordered partial measures. Yet many jurisdictions turned a blind eye, they note, to non-compliance with social distancing recommendations issued by the CDC, as evidenced by crowded beaches and children congregating in public parks. This is the dark side of federalism. It encourages a patchwork response to epidemics, the authors write. A federal takeover of all public health orders would be out of step with our federalist structure, the authors state, but there remain 3 good options. The White House must reverse its current trajectory toward prematurely weakening existing federal measures and the resolve of governors who are enforcing stay-at-home orders and school closures. Trump said last week, we wanted the United States opened up and raring to go by Easter. A few days later, he heeded the call of medical experts and extended social distancing guidelines until the end of April. But public health experts believe the crisis will likely be with us longer. Congress should use its spending power to further encourage states to follow a uniform playbook for community mitigation that includes measures for effective enforcement of public health orders. It could threaten to withhold some federal funds from states that do not comply. Congress could leverage its interstate commerce powers to regulate economic activities that affect the interstate spread of COVID-19, such as restricting large businesses from traveling and operating across state lines in ways that expose workers to risk. The White House could also make further use of the Defense Production Act to direct private companies to produce badly needed ventilators and personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, the authors write. Trump has ordered General Motors to manufacture ventilators, and the $2 trillion stimulus package includes $1 billion for DPA projects. Learning is difficult in the midst of an emergency, but one lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is already clear. When epidemiologists warn that a pathogen has become potential, the time to fly the flag of local freedom is over, the authors conclude. Yet national leadership in epidemic response works only if it is evidence-based. It is critical that the US response to COVID-19 going forward be not only national, but rational. We're gonna watch one more video.
For millions of Americans, quarantine now feels annoyingly normal. But just a few months ago, it seemed unbelievable. When Jared Evans returned to the US from Wuhan, China in January, he became one of the first Americans the federal government had quarantined in more than 50 years.
So walk me through this when you land. Where did you land?
We landed in Alaska first, because we was getting our temperature checks. I mean, everyone's taking major precautions. But then we got back on a plane and came to California. We landed at a military base. I think it was like 2 days later, like the government's going to give us a federal quarantine. So we just said, okay, all right.
In California, could you have walked off the base and said, I'm a free person, I can do what I want?
No, sir. You're on federal quarantine. You know, you either be that or I guess in jail.
The feds actually have the power to keep you forcibly quarantined if you have one of these diseases. COVID-19 was just added to the list. Even though the CDC has the power to isolate and detain someone, the authority to keep them on lockdown usually falls on the states. In 2014, Ebola was spreading through West Africa. In the US, at least 18 states issued quarantine guidelines due to the epidemic.
Thank you guys. I have to go speak with the health department now.
An American nurse named Casey Hickox went to Sierra Leone to work with Doctors Without Borders. After returning to the US, the state of New Jersey quarantined her in a tent after she showed no symptoms. She later sued Governor Chris Christie. Her settlement created a sort of quarantine Bill of Rights. Professor Carl Tobias teaches constitutional law at the University of Richmond. He isn't sure if it's the states or the feds who decides who gets quarantined and who doesn't.
It leaves a lot of discretion in public officials that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I would think. And so the stakes are huge. I'm thinking about the clash between what Trump is saying about the economy and trying to salvage that at the same time as, you know, the notion that people should go back to work could make the epidemic or pandemic worse. Those are going to be difficult to sort out, and I suppose they're going to end up in court. There's a pretty broad sort of police power to protect public health, safety, and welfare. the national government, the state governments, the local government can protect their citizens from dangers of all sorts, and especially one like the present one.
With the death toll rising in the United States, more Americans seem open to the idea. 74% of Americans would support a federal quarantine. But President Trump isn't considering it now.
A group came to me and they wanted to do the quarantine, and I said, let's think about it, and we did, and we studied it, and by the time the evening came, it just was something that was very unwieldy, very tough to enforce, and something we didn't want to do.
For now, while the White House has issued guidelines and best practices, enforcing these measures falls on local and state officials, and everything else is on us.
So COVID-19, the pandemic, the response, gives us an excellent case study in some of the issues that arise in federal systems and some of the problems that have to be sorted out periodically. And I want us to stop here and step back and have a discussion. And my question for you is, what issues in federal systems raised by the COVID-19 pandemic are depicted in the video and the article above? What are the main issues? How does our federal system affect the response to the COVID-19 pandemic? What questions arise? What are the main conflicts? What are the main challenges? What comes to mind when we watch this video, when we read that article, when we think about federalism?
Can I go?
Of course, Efren.
So my perspective, it kind of goes, well, I was thinking of also like the Bill of Rights. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I was like considering like the freedom of speech. Like it kind of raises a concern of like federalism in terms like how much government can do in regards to like the freedom of speech. And like, so citizens may be thinking that it's their freedom to say like, oh, I reject this, like in the video says like the nurse is proposing a quarantine, I don't know, something, right? Like I forgot what the document was. And so it kind of shows that people say like, oh, it's my freedom. Like I have the ability to like raise my concerns and not like, and go against like any like safety measures. But like also like it kind of raises the question of like how much government has power in during scenarios like such as like the pandemic. And yeah.
Yeah, another question, Efren, is which government, right? So in the case that you mentioned, the question of the freedom of movement of that nurse, Hickox, who went to, I'm forgetting which country, to deal with the Ebola crisis. And when she returned, the New Jersey government ordered her to quarantine, and she sued, and it eventually led to the creation of this sort of quarantine Bill of Rights. But she sued, claiming that her freedom of movement was violated. The issue arises, well, to what extent does your freedom of movement override the safety of the citizens of an entire state? And can the government of that state force you to quarantine in the interest of the health of the rest of the citizens of that state? Do we value your freedom of movement over the health and safety of those people? Or do we value the health and safety of those people over your freedom of movement? And does that state government have that power to order that quarantine? Or is that something that must come from above, from the federal government? Who has that power? Does that power even exist at all if it comes at the expense of someone's freedom of movement? These are really core issues that relate to not just questions of rights, but also the question of power and responsibility and jurisdiction and in a whole set of issues that really are quite important.
I think it also raises like that difficult question whether hate speech is freedom of speech also. It's kind of like that type of thing, I feel. I think that obviously like it's really up to the states and how they, how seriously they take the situation at hand and how they want to, handle it. For example, California has, they have pretty strict regulations in terms of, wearing your mask everywhere you go, and you can't enter a building without wearing a mask. But here where I live in the Central Valley, it's a little bit more lenient, I guess, because our local government It's a more Republican, so they believe that a lot of stores here in the Central Valley don't follow those regulations. So it's really hard because you have the federal, then you have the state, and then you even have sometimes your local government. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to add on.
Good point, Caesar. It is interesting how like it is kind of like a patchwork of responses, right? It's a little bit different in some places versus others. And the differences cut across states, but also across counties and cities and towns. And I even observe it here in New York. I live in the Hudson Valley. I live in technically like the greater metro area of New York City, but some of the more conservative places, they don't observe the social distancing as rigorously, and they're not as careful about the masks. But where I live in Kingston, which is a bluer area, they're very, very aggressive about distancing and mask wearing. And you can see the changes from place to place if you travel. And sometimes that patchwork response is a little bit unnerving because, you know, it seems to cast doubt on the overall response, right? You know, if you're inclined to believe the evidence, which suggests that mask mandates really reduce the spread, sometimes it's frustrating when these different areas or different places don't seem to follow the guidelines, and that's observable in the Central Valley, but also up here in the Hudson Valley in New York. So what other issues in federal systems raised by COVID-19 are depicted in the video and the article? What else do you see kind of standing out or coming up here that we should pay attention to?
It's mostly the fact that it seemed like every state had a different response because Donald Trump said the states could handle it how they saw fit. And it seemed like the redder states, as we've all said, kind of took a lighter approach, and the bluer states took a lockdown approach. Because here in California, we're going on 7 months of lockdown. But if you go to places like Alabama, they're open and free, and social distancing is a lot more lenient. And it's just an issue because, like, if we want to get through this, we needed a national response of everyone has to do this. Everyone needs to, like, wash their hands, social distance, wear masks, and we'd have gotten through this a lot faster.
Agreed. And I'm gonna ask Stephen, do you think, Stephen, that this is sort of like an abdication of the role and responsibility of the federal government?
I'm confused by your question.
Let me rephrase it, sorry. Do you feel as though the federal government had a role and a responsibility here that they failed to fulfill?
100%.
Okay. And this is something that comes up too, the question of, well, whose responsibility is it, right? We have these different levels of government. Clearly, the Trump administration believed that this is the role and the responsibility of states who can decide on their own what to do. But the whole point of that Vice video I just showed you was to highlight that, yes, the federal government does have the power to impose a nationwide quarantine, as well as mask mandates and et cetera. And so when the federal government failed to use that role and that responsibility and that power, we begin to talk about the failure of the government to perform an essential duty, or to kind of take responsibility or take a leading role that only it has, kind of legally speaking. Other issues also seem to arise that we haven't yet discussed. Some of the more interesting issues relate to disagreements between states and the federal government about who has the power to do certain things. Before I read some of the contributions in the chat, can we hear anyone else through the mic who has something they want to add?
Yeah, I thought it was also like pretty telling, the part where they brought up the fact that 74% of Americans supported a lockdown, and we still didn't do it. I think it just ties into what was just being talked about. Like, they're not only are they not fulfilling like the role and the responsibility that they have, but they're not even fulfilling the will of the people that they represent.
Yeah, so here's another element, right? What about responsiveness and representation? And what about the preferences of people at large. We talk about the differences and preferences between states, but what happens when you have national polling data that says 74% of people nationwide want this? Doesn't it then fall to that federal government to respond meaningfully to that aggregate, that collective who says quite, decisively that we want this mandate or this federal response? Yet again, we're confronting this same question, which is whose role and responsibility is it? And what's interesting about the video is that it highlights that it's actually not an easy question to answer. It sort of seems obvious that, well, we should be able to know whose responsibility it is. We should be able to figure that out by just looking at the legal code, right? Not necessarily. There's a lot of discretion and a lot of latitude given to both state as well as federal authorities. And so there's disagreement among them about whose responsibility it is. One thing that is absolutely clear is that the federal government does have some power, even if it's contested, to impose these kinds of mandates. And then the question is, whose role and responsibility, whose power is it? What are the limits of federal power and federal responsibility? What are the limits of state power and state responsibility? Who should be in charge of this? We also see coordination problems in the fact that many states didn't pursue aggressive responses like others did. We see a duplication of effort in many cases between states and the federal government. For instance, some states had to obtain their own ventilators, while the federal government was also trying to obtain ventilators. Wouldn't it have been easier for the federal government alone to have obtained those? It's obviously a duplication of responsibility and functions that can contribute to waste, a lack of coordination, et cetera. And finally, the inequalities between individual states. Those states that have performed better have largely imposed those mandates and followed the rigorous distancing guidelines, et cetera. Those that have not performed as well and where people still remain either very sick or very much exposed to the virus, or at least more so than in other states, those states commonly did not impose mandates. And in fact, even the smaller red states that at one point thought that they wouldn't be affected by COVID were affected just much later. There was a delay in the kind of gradual seeping of it into those places. But they were affected, and they saw bubbles and spikes that they didn't anticipate. So there's a lot here. There's just so much here. And the example of COVID-19 helps to bring into focus a lot of the issues. And it helps us to see that federal systems can be responsive to local and state needs, but they can also be prone to disorder and dysfunction. And they can also stymie the response as well because of the sheer number of governments and the coordination problems that can arise. That quote from the article was very, very telling. COVID-19 exposes the limits of federalism and the limits of a patchwork response that is characteristic of federalism. So Joris says there is no agreement between state and federal governments. While some states put up strict public health orders, others did not. Some states took higher precautions than others. Without unity, federalism cannot prosper. Also, people's lives were put at stake. Yeah, and the arbitrary nature of it all too, right? Like the fact that in states that did aggressively promote mandates and distancing guidelines, people were less likely to get sick. In places where the states did not impose mandates and guidelines, people were much more exposed to the health risk. And so there's that inequality in addition to the stakes, in addition to the health risks that come along with the virus itself. Manuel says, because subnational governments are able to undermine the authority of the national government, there wasn't a cohesive response to the pandemic. But Manuel, I'd ask you, don't you think that the states probably stepped in and used authority the ways they did because there was an absence of a federal response? If there had been a federal response, do you think the states would have taken the lead in the way that they did? Or do you think the states were acting that way regardless of what the federal government did? Because we did see in the video that there have been disagreements between state governments and the federal government. In particular, that the Trump administration has said over and over that it's up to the states in response to state governors saying, will you please impose a nationwide mandate? I don't know. I think it's a question about conflicts of power and power struggles, perhaps, but maybe more importantly, it's a question about whose role and responsibility managing the crisis really is. And in some ways, states have kind of filled the void left by the abdication of responsibility of the federal government. Rady says, in border restrictions, which it forces people to stay in their state, it could be considered a restriction of freedom. So, and Rady, what you're pointing out, those restrictions, those travel restrictions, those are imposed by states, right? If the federal government had imposed them, that might be different. And maybe there would be questions about the power of states versus the federal government to impose those restrictions on freedom of movement. The questions that arise then relate to the distribution of power and whose responsibility or whose power it is to do that, and if they can do that. Stephen says the pandemic could not have come at a worse time. This election is bringing out the polarization and pettiness of the Democrats and the Republicans as we see our president mock his opponent for wearing a mask and listening to science when that is something he should have done to begin with. Yeah, and of course the dramatic irony is that President Trump and his entire White House got COVID-19. The virus that they pretended didn't exist, they finally contracted because of their recklessness and their irresponsibility. And so, you know, that's the meaning of dramatic irony. When you see it happen ahead of time, when you see the fate of those who don't heed the possibility of like disaster. We've got 3 minutes left, and I want to hear from a few more people before we wrap up this part of the lecture. What else does this video and this article highlight regarding the issues that come up in federal systems?
I think it also highlights the ambiguity with a lot of the I guess like procedures. Like in the video they were showing how a lot of people didn't know who had the power to do what. So I think it just kind of highlights that that federal systems can be kind of tricky, I guess, when it comes to who can do what.
Yeah, so one of the things that becomes possible when you have all these different levels of government is disagreements and uncertainty about who actually has what responsibility and who actually does what. And on the face of it, it seems like it should be obvious, right? Well, shouldn't it be obvious who does what? Shouldn't we have this written down? But the fact is, there's a lot of ambiguity, as Jake points out, and there's often the need for courts to adjudicate and determine whether it's the states, counties, cities, or the federal government who have a certain responsibility. And that ambiguity is not possible in a unitary state where there's a single concentration of power in the national government, and everything else flows from that. And so not only do we have coordination issues that arise, power struggles, but there's also this ambiguity surrounding the responsibility that different actors have when it comes to managing a crisis. So for instance, in the text, we saw that there are emergency powers granted to the executive, but that states individually can also impose mandates and guidelines and can essentially use emergency powers as well. And so then the question is, well, if there's this duplication of responsibilities, who is actually in charge of the response? And is this written down? And as we saw, it's not actually written down. It's something that is subject to discretion, and it's something that is often interpreted differently by different courts and different judges. And so this is the thing about politics that's often the most interesting, but the most difficult to grasp. The ambiguity that surrounds the writing of laws and the distribution of power. Who does what? Who has what responsibility? This is why we have courts, after all. But the role of the courts in responding to these disagreements that arise, it's also problematic because courts take a long time to make decisions, and we need to respond quickly and decisively to this issue. As the article said, COVID-19 unfolded quickly and rapidly, and the slow federal and state response has limited the ability of both to respond meaningfully. And when you involve courts who have to adjudicate disputes, it becomes even more challenging to respond quickly, and it becomes impossible because the courts have to interpret and kind of assess the relative role of the different actors and different players, and that often is subject to review itself. And so there's a lot here, and the ambiguity, in addition to the power struggles, in addition to the duplication, all of these challenges arise in the context of COVID-19, and they highlight the limits of federalism. So we're not actually quite done with this lecture, but we'll finish on Thursday, and we'll start up on our new unit. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. You're welcome to be on your way or stick